Welcome back to CJ 213. We're reviewing Chapter 11. We're talking about special prison populations. So, when we talk about special prison populations, we're not talking about a small subgroup on the margins of corrections. We're talking about a majority of the modern prison population. Um, Over my experience, one of the biggest misconceptions I saw, especially among new officers, was the belief that prisons are designed for everyone equally. Well, they're not. Most prisons were built for young, healthy, able-bodied men, and that assumption no longer holds. Special populations really stress staffing, budgets, safety procedures, housing decisions, use of force policies, and obviously constitutional law. If you don't understand these populations, you don't understand modern corrections. So some categories of special prison populations. So Chapter 11 really kind of breaks down special populations into three categories: special offense incarcerated persons, special needs incarcerated persons, and special populations based on age or status or circumstances. In practice, these categories overlap constantly. At Pontiac, I supervised inmates who were drug offenders. They were mentally ill, aging, disabled, undocumented, all at the same time. Classification systems try to separate these groups, but reality doesn't cooperate. This overlap increases the risk of misclassification, improper housing, inappropriate discipline, and then you also have the civil liability. So understanding these categories helps staff make very defensible decisions. So substance involved incarcerated persons. So substance involvement is one of the most common characteristics of incarcerated populations. Nearly half of all federal inmates are drug offenders, and most states and jails, the inmates there, they meet criteria for substance abuse or dependence. So from an officer's perspective, substance abuse isn't just a criminal history issue, it's a behavioral management issue. Many inmates arrive with long-term addictions, family histories of substance abuse, poor education, limited employment history, and these factors really correlate with institutional misconduct, poor impulse control, and difficulty following rules and orders. One of the most dangerous moments in custody is what's called immediate withdrawal. Detoxing inmates require close monitoring. Alcohol withdrawal, in particular, can be fatal. They have hallucinations, seizures, cardiac problems, and these are medical emergencies that can look like defiance or psychosis if staff aren't trained. Substance abuse really fuels underground economies, violence over debts, manipulation of weaker inmates. This turns addiction into a security threat, not just a health concern. So when it does come to this specific area of withdrawal, so prisons in itself don't really see that much unless the inmates are getting the narcotics and whatever while they're incarcerated. This generally is more directed towards the jails, because the jails where they're getting offenders right off the street going straight behind bars. So it's the jail security that really have to deal with this, not so much prisons, because once they get to prison, generally they've already been detoxed. So most programs for substance abuse involved incarcerated persons include 90% of all state and federal prisons, and some offer some form of substance abuse counseling. Most prisons offer some form, but participation is often pretty low. As it says, one in eight incarcerated persons have participated in such programs. That's pretty low. Inmates who voluntarily enter treatment are often easier to manage. They're much more structured. They're less disruptive. The problem, of course, is access. Programming slots are very limited. Waiting lists are long. Many inmates cycle out before completing treatment. Treatment inside a prison without continuity on the street has a very limited long-term impact. So does drug treatment work? Research shows prison-based improvement and institutional adjustment really helps reduce recidivism. However, the benefits disappear quickly if release is unplanned, if their housing is unstable, if treatment stops immediately. Corrections can't fix addiction alone, but ignoring it guarantees continued system involvement. So sex offenders. So sex offenders make up a significant portion of prison populations, though exact numbers do kind of vary. Where I came from, sex offenders were among the most at-risk inmates. Many required protective custody because the inmate code, inmate justice places them all the way at the bottom of any type of hierarchy. Megan's Law and sex offender registration ensure punishment continues long after release once they get out, creating many barriers to housing, employment, and reintegration. So the problem of working with sex offenders. So sex offenders often struggle with isolation, mental health issues, institutional adjustment. So without protective custody, they face many assaults or even homicide in the prisons. Although overall recidivism rates are lower, the risk of sex crime rearrest shortly after release remains a major public concern, increasing pressure on parole and supervision agencies. So we had quite a few, actually a lot of sex offenders in the prison, and they had to be in protective custody. If they weren't, yeah, prison justice, as I said, it takes care of itself. That's why there's protective custody. They do still have the constitutional right to be safe. And yes, we had to protect. So civil commitment facilities. Civil commitment allows states to detain certain sex offenders indefinitely after sentence completion. These facilities operate at the intersection of corrections, mental health, and of course civil law. They raise serious constitutional questions about due process and punishment way beyond sentence. So terrorists in prison. So terrorist inmates differ from traditional offenders because their motivation is ideological rather than a personal gain. So facilities like ADX in Florence, they exist because even limited communication can enable things like recruitment, coordination, radicalization. So security focuses on isolation and communication control, not rehabilitation. So Guantanamo Bay, yes, this is a perfect example of what a facility looks like that houses terrorists. Complete communication control. There's no rehabilitation. It's just to keep them from communicating with their terrorist organizations. So the ticking time bomb scenario is often cited in national security debates. While we as correctional officers don't interrogate unless it's in a certain situation where it's an institutional level interrogation where, whether it was a homicide or drugs or something like that. We don't interrogate. So these debates, they influence public perception, policy, and legal standards regarding detainee treatment. So corrections professionals really have to understand the the constitutional boundaries that really govern custody. So the special needs. When we talk about special needs, we're talking about individuals whose mental conditions fundamentally change how corrections manage them. These inmates don't just need services, they require different supervision strategies, housing decisions, communication styles, and disciplinary approaches. Many of the most frequent disciplinary problems I encountered involved inmates who should have never been in general population to begin with. Not because they were dangerous, but because they could not function within standard prison expectations. When prisons fail to identify special needs early, those needs don't disappear. They reappear as misconduct reports, use of force incidents, segregation, and obviously lawsuits. So, incarcerated persons with HIV. HIV in the correctional settings has declined over the past decade, but management challenges, they still remain very complex. One of the biggest issues that I saw among staff was fear rooted in misinformation. Officers would worry about exposure through casual contact, which is not how HIV transmission works. So this creates tension around whether inmates should be segregated, whether officers should be notified, whether education promotes risky behavior. So legally and ethically, universal precautions exist specifically so disclosure is unnecessary. When staff rely on training instead of fear, facilities are much safer for everyone. So then you have the HIV programs and the reentry. Many prison systems, they now rely on peer education models for HIV positive inmates, and for a very good reason. Inmates often trust peers more than staff, especially when discussing stigma and medication adherence and reentry fears. So, from a correction standpoint, continuity, continuity of care is absolutely critical. If an inmate leaves prison without immediate access to medication, the system has just created a public health problem. It hasn't solved one. So this is where corrections intersects directly with community health systems, whether administrations like it or not. So nearly 70% of incarcerated persons report at least one disability, and many of them have multiple disabilities. So this kind of has the overlapping impairments. So this matters operationally because disabilities, they affect processing speed, understanding commands, sensory perception, and emotional regulation. I saw incidents escalate because officers interpreted delayed compliance as defiance, when in reality the inmate simply just could not process the instructions quickly. So this isn't about lowering standards. It's about recognizing functional limitations to to prevent unnecessary force and liabilities. So more than half of incarcerated individuals have a diagnosable mental health condition. That's a lot. And correctional facilities, they were never designed to be the nation's largest mental health providers. Yet that is exactly what they become. Uh, I saw officers routinely manage inmates that were experiencing issues such as psychosis. I saw this. Obviously, severe depression. Many of them had this. Uh, Trauma responses. Every inmate had some type of trauma in their life, whether it be before they were in prison or when they were incarcerated. Personality disorders were a big one too. So without adequate staffing, officers become the mental health first responders, often without sufficient training or authority to divert inmates from punishment-based responses. I was part of the the crisis intervention team, so I did get a lot of training in mental health, what to look for, things such as that. But not everybody gets that. So, and they just touch on this in the academy. So new officers coming into the facilities, they just have a small glimpse into what they're really getting into. So it's almost kind of on the job training, so to speak. But I really think that they need to put more emphasis into this because mental health is a big issue in corrections. So the closure of state mental hospitals, specifically in the 1980s, it didn't eliminate mental illness. It just shifted to the prisons. So when treatment resources are inadequate, systems really have to rely heavily upon segregation. They have to rely on discipline and force. And this really does create a cycle where mental illness is punished. Symptoms just worsen, they don't get better. Institutional behavior just deteriorates. And when brutality occurs, it is often framed as individual failure, but more often it actually reflects uh, a systemic underfunding and just a unrealistic expectation that is placed on correctional staff. So the aging prison population is definitely growing. It's probably seen the most significant changes in modern corrections today. So there's now more than 178,000 incarcerated persons over the age of 55. And that number is growing rapidly due to longer sentences and the tough on crime policies. I supervise inmates who entered prison in their 20s and aged entirely behind bars. Prison was the only Prison became the only adult life that they knew. So older inmates, they often show higher um, compliance and program participation because they also became very institutionally dependent. Simple decisions like choosing meals, managing medications, or just navigating transportation becomes very overwhelming after decades of incarceration. Well, from a reentry perspective, release can actually increase vulnerability, not reduce it. So then you have the financial costs. Uh, Elderly inmates are expensive, often costing $70,000 a year, and this is kind of mostly due to chronic medical care. And this really raises policy questions um, that the prison administration just can't ignore. There has to be a compassionate release, medical parole, public versus safety costs. These decisions are increasingly driven by budget realities, not just sentencing philosophies. I can give you numerous accounts of how expensive elderly cost is. I've taken many inmates on medical furloughs to hospitals. I've seen the care that they're given at these hospitals. They're given care that me and you might not even get. Uh, and who has to pay for it? The taxpayers. And it can get very expensive because they can't be denied medical treatment. So the problem with working with older adults, um, They become more vulnerable to physical victimization, medical neglect, isolation again. They require safer housing. They need predictable routines and just increased medical oversight. Failure to provide this, as I said, it increases a constitutional risk under the Eighth Amendment for just deliberate indifference. They got this coming to them. So we may not like it. As a taxpayer, we don't like it, but it's a reality covered under the Constitution. So, federal standards now prohibit housing transgender inmates based solely on their anatomy. Uh, this really represents a major shift in classification philosophy, and this really requires individual assessments, and it definitely includes staff training and just a very clear policy guidance from an officer's perspective. Ambiguity increases risk, but clear policy protects both the inmates and staff. We may not totally agree with everything, but as correctional professionals, it goes back to the professionalism. Because you don't agree with it, don't mean you have to voice your opinion on it. You just have to follow the policies, and it's important the policies are clear. So we have corrections and undocumented immigrants. Despite strong evidence showing undocumented immigrants commit violent crimes at lower rates, public fear has really driven expanded detention. This places a whole lot more additional burdens on correctional systems that are already just overflowing and operating in capacity. So then you also have language barriers. They are they're not minor inconveniences. They're huge safety risks. Miscommunication really could escalate routine interactions into very serious incidents. So without having bilingual staff or translation resources, officers really rely on guesswork. Really have to read body language. We may not be able to understand what they're saying, but we may be able to, in some way, convey what they're trying to get across through their body language. All this is unacceptable, especially in a high-risk environment. Luckily, we did have several bilingual staff, and they were called upon a lot. They were compensated. There was such thing called bilingual pay. So if you do speak two languages and you go into corrections, you're going to get paid more, which as you should, because you're going to get leaned on a lot. So the programs for undocumented immigrants. So family detention centers attempt to humanize detention, but raise very ethical concerns for child development and education access. And then there's also the psychological harm. Corrections increasingly intersects with human rights law, whether the agencies are prepared or not. So up to 15% of incarcerated individuals were homeless prior to incarceration. So many prisons provide the stability that they didn't have on the street, the food they didn't have on the street, and obviously the medical care. This creates a really dangerous dynamic when release represents a loss of security. So that definitely does increase the recidivism rate. I have seen numerous inmates that they parole out and they're back in days because they can't make it on the street. We have something called 3 hots and a cot. So 3 hot meals and a bed. They didn't have that on the street. They didn't have medical care on the street. So many homeless people will commit a crime just to get locked up so they can survive. So veterans. So this really is hard for me because I am a veteran. Um, so veterans face a very unique challenge related to trauma, substance abuse, and mental health, and youth who experience homelessness often have histories of family instability, school failure, and victimization. These factors really compound justice system involvement across the life of this inmate. Then you have the reentry programs for the unhoused. Um, Housing first reentry programs really show strong results, but policy barriers really block access to federal housing assistance. Corrections can release someone successfully, but without housing, failure is almost a guarantee. All right, so special populations are not exceptions. They are the rule in modern corrections. From my 23 years, I learned this. The, the way a system treats its most vulnerable inmates predicts its safety, legitimacy, and long term success. If corrections fails special populations, it, it fails everyone. So thank you for joining me here in Special Prison Populations. I will see you back next week for our our last week, which is capital punishment.